Today, we're tackling Immanuel Kant. You gotta admit, the guy's a philosophical rock star.
We're talking about someone who took on the biggest questions out there. What is reality? How do we know anything at all?
And it all started with Kant having this epiphany back in 1763. He read some Rousseau and boom, everything changes. He even said it made him learn to honor man.
To have a single book spark such a profound change, it makes you wonder, do we ever really know what we think until something really challenges those beliefs?
This experience sent him on an intellectual journey that lasted almost 2 decades.
That's how long it took him to write his masterpiece.
The critique of pure reason, right?
Imagine trying to rebuild the entire foundation of knowledge from scratch. That's what Kant was doing. On one side, you had the empiricists, like David Hume, saying all our knowledge comes from experience, from our senses. Seems logical, right?
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
You'd think so. But Hume took it to a whole other level. He started questioning everything, even basic things like cause and effect. Like, how do we really know one thing causes another? Can we ever really prove it? Or do we just see them happening together and make an assumption?
That kind of throws a wrench into the whole scientific method, doesn't it?
Exactly. Science relies on this idea that there are laws governing the universe, that things happen in predictable ways. If you start doubting cause and effect, where does that leave us? On the other side, you have the rationalists. Think Descartes. I think, therefore I am. They were trying to build knowledge from pure reason, logic alone. The problem was, it's hard to explain the entire universe just by sitting and thinking.
Okay, so we've got the empiricists saying it's all about experience, the rationalists saying it's all about reason, it's a philosophical showdown. And this is where Kant comes in, right? Trying to find some kind of middle ground.
Exactly. He wants to save science, but he also wants to save morality. He's looking for a way to bring reason and experience together.
A philosophical peace treaty.
And how does he do it? He pulls off a total philosophical revolution. He even called it his Copernican revolution.
Let's unpack this whole Copernican revolution. What was Kant's big idea?
Before Kant, philosophers thought our minds were like mirrors, just reflecting the world as it really is. Knowledge meant your mind making a perfect copy of reality. Kant flips that idea on its head. He said, the world we experience, what he called the phenomenal world, is actually shaped by our minds. Our senses, the way we think, even how we understand things like space and time, they all contribute to creating our reality. It's not just out there, it's in here too.
So we're not just watching the world, we're helping to create it.
But here's the catch. Kant also said there is a real world out there, independent of our minds. He called it the noumenal world.
Okay, so 2 worlds. The one we experience and the real one.
But we can never truly know that noumenal world the way it is in itself.
Why not?
Our minds can only ever access the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it, shaped by our senses and our minds. It's about recognizing the limits of our own perception. Imagine we're all living in a video game. We can interact with the game world, but we can't reach out and touch the code itself. That code, that's the noumenal world.
Wow. Okay, so how does any of this help us understand anything? If we can't trust our senses to show us the real world, how can we do science?
That's the beauty of Kant's idea. He's not saying science is impossible. He's actually trying to give it a stronger foundation. Even though we can't know the noumenal world directly, Kant says our minds still structure our experiences in consistent, predictable ways. Our minds impose things like cause and effect, space and time, onto our experience.
So it's like we're all playing the same video game, just with slightly different settings. We're all experiencing the world through the same basic framework, even if our individual experiences within that framework are unique.
Exactly. It's a shared structure. And that's why science is still possible. We can study the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it, and find reliable, consistent laws. Those laws may not apply to the ultimate unknowable reality, but they work within the framework of our experience.
Okay, so that's how he saves science. But what about all those other big questions we love to debate? The big ones, God, free will, the soul. What happens to those in Kant's Copernican revolution?
He doesn't exactly give you a straight yes or no answer. See, because we can't really know that noumenal world, that world as it truly is. Kant says we can't make any definitive claims about what exists or doesn't exist in that realm. He's saying we can't prove there's a God, but we can't disprove it either. It's like he's saying, keep those big questions open.
He's walking this line between total skepticism and traditional belief.
Kant was a pretty religious guy himself, and he was really into morality.
Yeah.
He wanted to make those ideas fit with the limits of what we can actually know. His solution was this. Our reason can't prove religious concepts, but it also can't disprove them. He called this making room for faith.
Making room for faith. It's like acknowledging that there's this whole other realm of human experience, spirituality, meaning all that goes beyond what science can measure or prove. Did he ever say why we even need those ideas? If we can't know for sure, why not just stick with what we can know?
He didn't see these traditional ideas, God, the soul, free will, as useless. He actually thought they were super important, maybe even vital for how we understand morality. Imagine a world without free will, for example. In that scenario, how can you hold anyone responsible for anything they do? He decided that for morality to even exist, for it to make any sense at all, we have to have this idea of freedom. We have to at least believe that we have the ability to choose between right and wrong, even if we can't prove for sure that some kind of determinism isn't controlling everything.
He's saying even if science can't give us a definitive answer about free will, we have to act as if it's real. Otherwise, ethics, morality, the whole thing just falls apart.
This is where his idea of practical reason comes into play.
Practical reason.
I might not have all the answers about the universe and how it all works, but I can still try to live a good life. I can still make choices that line up with what I believe is right. It's about figuring out what we ought to do, how we should act, even when we can't be absolutely certain about anything.
That makes sense. It's like saying, I'm choosing to live as if these things matter, freedom, morality, all that, because I want to live in a world where those things matter.
Exactly. And remember, Kant was living in a time of huge upheaval, intellectual, social, political. It was the Enlightenment. Revolutions were happening. Monarchs were freaking out about all these new ideas.
And Kant's own king was one of those who was, let's say, a little bit controlling when it came to new ideas. Remember the whole censorship thing? On the one hand, you've got freedom of thought, but on the other, you've got this very real threat if you say the wrong thing.
But he complied with the censorship. But to really get why he made that choice, you have to understand what he was seeing happening around him. The French Revolution, for example, wasn't some abstract political debate for Kant.
He was seeing the very real consequences of these big ideas playing out, and they weren't always pretty.
Exactly. And he wasn't immune to the fear that these radical new ideas, while exciting and inspiring, could also lead to chaos and violence.
Kant was living in a time when the stakes were incredibly high.
So even though it seems contradictory, this champion of reason, choosing to stay silent, really shows how complex Kant's thinking was. He was struggling with those limits of reason, the potential for good and bad, to come from the same ideas. It wasn't simple for him.
Standing up for what you believe in isn't always straightforward. Sometimes it's messy, and there are no easy answers.
Exactly. Sometimes those in power don't want to hear what you have to say.
Which is exactly what we're going to unpack next, Kant's ideas on obedience, especially when it comes to those in charge.
Here's this guy, all about reason, right? Dedicated his life to showing how powerful it can be to think for yourself. And then, bam, he decides to go along with censorship.
Yeah, it seems backwards, right? Especially coming from a guy who's all about using your brain. So how do we make sense of this? How do these two sides of Kant fit together?
It's all about understanding the time he was living in. Like we talked about before, the French Revolution was happening, things were intense. And it made him realize that just because people can think for themselves doesn't mean they always will, or even should, at least not all the time.
You're saying he started to see the downsides of unchecked freedom.
Yeah, think about it. The French Revolution, it started with all these noble ideals, liberty, equality, all that. But it quickly spiraled into chaos and violence. And Kant, he saw that as a cautionary tale. He started to think, maybe humans aren't quite as rational and reasonable as we like to believe. Maybe we need some structure, some rules to keep us in check.
So he wasn't saying get rid of reason. He was saying reason alone isn't enough.
We need something more. We need morality. We need a sense of duty.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So how does that play out in his philosophy? How do we figure out what our duty is?
That's where his famous categorical imperatives come in. Think of it like the ultimate moral rule book, something that applies to everyone all the time. No exceptions.
Okay, what are these categorical imperatives all about?
They're about doing the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. Not because you're scared of punishment, not because you want a reward, but because your own reason tells you it's the right thing to do. And Kant, he believed that deep down, even with all our flaws, we have this ability to recognize and follow these moral laws. In fact, he even said that following those laws, that's what makes us truly free.
How does having to follow a bunch of rules make you free? That seems a bit counterintuitive.
See, Kant didn't see freedom as just doing whatever you felt like in the moment. He thought that kind of freedom, it could actually be a form of slavery, like being controlled by your impulses and desires. He thought true freedom came from choosing to align yourself with something bigger than yourself, a universal moral law.
It's less about having unlimited choices and more about having the self-control to make the right choices, even when they're hard.
You got it. That's Kant in a nutshell. And he had a really interesting way of testing whether an action was morally right. He called it the universalizability principle. Basically, you have to ask yourself, could I live in a world where everyone did this? If the answer is no, then it's probably not a good rule to follow. And this brings us to what might be the most debatable part of Kant's philosophy, his ideas about raising kids.
So how did Kant think we should be raising these little humans, with all his rules and duty and everything?
He was a big believer in discipline, structure, clear rules, consequences, the whole shebang.
Sounds strict.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly winning any Fun Parent of the Year awards. Kant believed that kids, they're actually born with this tendency towards, as he put it, lawlessness. They're driven by their immediate desires, and without some serious guidance, they just run wild. Kant's view was that parents and teachers, their job was to mold these little bundles of chaos into rational, responsible human beings. Now, to be fair, he wasn't advocating for being cruel or overly harsh, but he definitely believed in setting firm boundaries, teaching respect for authority, that kind of thing. Kant's ideas on child rearing, they push us to think about the balance between freedom and structure. It's a question that we're still grappling with today.
For sure. Every generation has to figure that out, right? Finding that balance.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so amazing about Kant. His ideas, even though they're over 200 years old now, they're still relevant. They still make us think about the big questions.
What does it even mean to be human? What does it mean to be free? How do we build a just and moral society?
And Kant, he gives us a framework for thinking about them, a starting point. He might not give us all the answers, but he definitely gets the conversation going.
He sure does. To our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What didn't? What are you still wrestling with? Thanks for joining us on this philosophical adventure. Until next time, keep those minds curious.